The minister was feeling rather proud of himself as he stood at the back shaking hands as the members gave him quite a few more compliments on his sermon that day than usual while they filed out at the end of the service. His wife was standing close by, observing the flow of the members and hearing the compliments and also shaking hands. And one elderly lady, sweet as she was, grasped the minister's hand with both of her hands and shook it for all it was worth, and with a very deliberate handshake as she told him how much she enjoyed his message that day. "You are such a model preacher," she said with a beaming smile. And at this, the minister's buttons were about to pop with pride. And after the elderly lady stepped away, the minister leaned over to his wife and said, "Did you hear that? I'm a model preacher." To which his wife calmly replied, "You do realize a model is a small, cheap imitation of the real thing." We're going to be spending some time in the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel is filled with so much that we tend to miss. And this book is probably one of the best books we could be looking at in times such as we are in now. And so we're going to spend most of today laying the groundwork for our study to prepare us to dig into the book of Daniel and the message it has for us. And so we're going to kind of probably move along at a fairly quick pace today because we've got a lot of groundwork that we do need to get laid into place. And I don't know if you're accustomed to doing so. You may even want to take some notes as we go through as the book of Daniel unfolds. Now, I doubt any of us has actually faced the level of despair that Daniel and his friends experienced. I mean, think about it, if you would. They had been dragged away from their homes and relocated thousands of miles away. And it's not like you can just jump on a plane and go back home. Thousands of miles meant a very, very long journey. And they were basically isolated completely from their families. Anyone that was left behind in Jerusalem, they virtually had no communication with at all anymore. And so you've got that as a part of the situation. And then you add to that, if you would, they've been castrated. Not very pleasant. It means they're not going to have a family. And family was everything to Jews. I mean, if you go back through, the lineage aspect of things is extremely important within the Jewish heritage. And then add on top of that, if you would, they are being immersed in the education of the occult. Okay? So basically to them, if you would, everything probably seems hopeless. This is a hopeless situation. They're thousands of miles away. They've been made eunuchs. They're being taught the occult, even though they've been brought up to worship the one true God, and failure to do that's kind of the reason the whole situation exists. And so everything probably seems hopeless. At least it probably would seem that way to us. And in the midst of all this, we have the accounts found in the book of Daniel. And maybe a good title for the book of Daniel would be, if you would, "There is hope when the world is falling apart." There's hope when the world is falling apart. And so, as we enter the book of Daniel, there are two questions the Israelites are facing. Two very difficult questions for the Israelites at this point in time. The first one is, if you would, is their God truly God as compared with the Babylonian God? That's the first question that's got to be on their minds. And then the second question would be, if you would, will God forgive the sin of His people and resume fellowship with them? And so as we begin to enter into the book of Daniel, we need to understand that those are the two primary questions that the Israelites are facing at this point in time. Is their God really God, if you would? Is our God truly God? And, if you would, will He forgive us and redeem us? And one of the keys to really beginning to get into the meat of what Daniel has to offer for us is understanding that through all of it, that is the underlying theme of the book of Daniel, answering those two questions. Those questions, is my God truly God in the light of my circumstances? Will He redeem me? And will He rescue me? And will things ever be okay again? Those are questions that truly every God-fearing person has asked at some point in their life. And if you haven't asked them yet, you will eventually. Because at some point in time, we find ourselves in circumstances where we struggle with those two questions. As we look at something going on in our lives, or something that's going on in a friend's life, or in different circumstances going on, we begin to ask ourselves, is God really God? Why is this going on? And so those are the questions that Daniel seeks to answer. Now, one of the things as we get into this, we need to understand something, and that is Daniel is a book we know about, but not completely. Okay? And that's because most of us have only tried to understand the first half of the book. And there are a few ways that the book can be divided up. First of all, one way is there's two halves. And if you would, there's the narrative half, chapters 1 through 6. And most of us know the narrative half. That's where we have the very famous stories of Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego and all that stuff. We're familiar with those. And, so most of us know about the narrative half. And about 40% of the Old Testament is narrative. But we read through the first half and think to ourselves, this is great. This is great. But the way we deal with it is not very good. Why? Well, the reason is when we typically approach Daniel and most of the Old Testament, what we do is, if you would, we don't apply a redemptive historic approach, a Christ-centered approach, and we reduce it to pure moralism, rather than seeking what's really there for us. So what do I mean by that? Well, we read through the first half of the book, and the lesson we get is, if you would, Daniel and his friends are great, morally upstanding guys. Be like them. Probably familiar with the old song, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, And that's how most people look at the book of Daniel. And that approach alone is mere moralism. Do what they did that was good so that God will be pleased with you and that everything will go well for you. That's the general approach we take to the narrative section of Daniel. In other words, do what's right and your life will go well. God will protect you, God will rescue you, and so on and so forth. But think about it for a minute. Let's really look at what we believe when we take that approach. You see, if you would, that moralistic view of Daniel is very similar to the health and wealth gospel. Everything goes well if you're right with God. And that, without realizing it, that is the theology we have a tendency to apply to Daniel. Do what pleases God, and everything will work out. Everything will be okay. Everything will go well. And so, we get that messed up, and that's the easy part. The second half is the really difficult stuff, and that is, if you would, the apocalyptic half. That section begins at chapter 7. And it is in this section that Daniel has the dreams and visions that he's interpreting. And because it is apocalyptic, most of us don't even bother reading it, much less try to understand it. We'll read up through chapter 6 and we'll read those nice, wonderful stories and everything about Daniel and his companions. But when we get to the apocalyptic section, we'll just skip on to something else. We just go to a good study Bible to tell us what we're supposed to believe about the symbolism there, and we leave it at that, rather than searching it and finding out if there's something there for us. For most of us, that's probably an ouch. Probably hits home a little bit. See, we view it from the perspective that there really isn't any value except to maybe interpret some of the signs of the end times, and so there isn't any real relevance for us today because it's intended for those in the end of days. Think about it. The vast majority of Christians are okay believing that God gave us a book that only half of it has any meaning for all of us, and the rest of it is just meaningless for everyone else except those that happen to be alive in the last days. And we tend to be okay with taking that approach to things. Yeah, the first 6 chapters, those are great for us, and the rest of it, that's for somebody else later on in the end of the age. And sadly, that's how we tend to approach it. Now, the book of Daniel is dated probably around 530 BC, and the events that took place in Daniel took place between 605 and 537. And the book would have been completed shortly thereafter. So, understanding that, and understanding that the approach that we're okay, that we seem to be okay with believing just the first half of the book means anything to us, and the second half is just for those who happen to be at the end of time. And isn't it interesting that most Christians are okay with the view that God would inspire a book of the Bible to be written, and half of it is absolutely meaningless to everyone down through the ages except those at the end of time? We seem to be okay with that. Let me share this with you. God did not give us a book, half of which is meaningless to everyone except those who happen to be alive at the end of the age. If you would, every part of Daniel had a meaning for the exiles, and every part of it has meaning for everyone after them until the end of the age, and that includes us. Not just the first chapters, not just the first 6, beginning at chapter 7 to the end, also has meaning for us. And it's more than just a moralistic view of things, which we will find as we get into Daniel. Daniel can also be divided into 2 languages. Daniel is the only book in the Bible that is like this, that is written in 2 languages. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 through the first part of Daniel chapter 2, verse 4 is written in Hebrew. The rest of Daniel chapter 2, verse 4 through Daniel chapter 7 is written in Aramaic. Then the rest of Daniel is written in Hebrew. So the structure you have of Daniel is, if you would, the Hebrew introduction, and if you would, the Aramaic body, and then if you would, the Hebrew closing. Then we find something else that's very interesting in the Aramaic section, and that is a perfect, if you would, chiasm. Does anybody know what a chiasm is? So what is a chiasm? Well, simply put, if you would, a chiasm is a repetition of similar ideas in the reverse sequence. The importance of the chiastic structure is found in its hidden emphasis and its clarification of context. Chiasms are found in various places throughout the Bible. Some of the Psalms are chiasms. As a matter of fact, you can even look at the Bible as a whole, and you find that the whole Bible is a chiasm. What is interesting is that this perfect chiasm is contained completely in the Aramaic section. And here's how it runs. If you would, chapter 2, there is a dream of a statue representing 4 kingdoms. Then, if you would, chapter 3, there is worship of the golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar, or perish in the fiery furnace. Then, if you would, chapter 4, there is the judgment of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now the same thing starts in reverse. If you would, chapter 5, there is judgment of King Belshazzar. And then if you would, chapter 6, there is worship of Darius, or perish in the den of lions. And then chapter 7, the chiasm ends with there is a dream of 4 beasts who represent 4 kingdoms. A perfect chiasm. And there is a message for everyone in that chiastic structure. And we'll look at that throughout our study of the book of Daniel as we get into things. Now we've laid some of the groundwork. Let's begin to get into the book itself and get a little more groundwork and background. So let's pick up Daniel chapter 1, the first 6 verses, where we read, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Let's pause there for just a moment. In the midst of the exile, the only exiles that the book really talks about just happen to be from the tribe of Judah. All these exiles are taken to Babylon, but the ones that Daniel talks about just happen to be from the tribe of Judah. Do you think there might be some significance there? The book of Daniel is basically telling the exiles that God is going to preserve his people. And if you would, the principal characters in the book are all from the tribe through whom the promised seed will come, the one from whom the scepter is never going to depart. Oh yes, there is an important connection here. There is a message in those that Daniel is writing about. So hang on to that thought as well as we go through the book of Daniel. Now let's also read verse 7, if you would. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So, now they're given new names. So, as we're beginning to look at this, as we're getting into this, the book of Daniel begins with the clash of two kingdoms. The kingdom of, if you would, Judah, and then also, if you would, the kingdom of Babylon. And in the clash of the two kingdoms, we also see, if you would, a clash of two kings. King Jehoiakim of Judah, and if you would, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And so we got two kingdoms, two kings that are clashing. And so let's get a little bit more background as we go. Jehoiakim was the son of Josiah, and unlike his father, he was an ungodly king. As a matter of fact, we read in 2 Kings 23, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Zebedah, daughter of Pedaiah. She was from Rumah, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his predecessors had done. So, during his reign, Nebuchadnezzar came and made Jehoiakim his servant for 3 years. Now, his father was a good king and tried to bring Judah back to God. But Jehoiakim, he was an evil king. Now, think about the situation, okay? Think about what's going on here to help us get an understanding of what all's happening. You've got these two superpowers. First of all, if you would, you got Babylon to the north. And then, if you would, Egypt to the south. And they are fighting for control of the region, and in the middle, at the crossroads, so to speak, is this little tiny sliver of land and a small country called Judah. They're in the crossfire of this constant war going on. Now, originally, Jehoiakim's brother, Jehoahaz, was made king by an anti-Egyptian faction. And he was also an evil king, and he only reigned for 3 months. And then the Egyptian emperor Necho deposed him and put him in chains and hauled him away, and put his brother Jehoiakim, who was pro-Egypt at the time, on the throne in his place. Because prior to Nebuchadnezzar conquering Jerusalem, Egypt was in control. And so the expectation was that he would remain loyal to Egypt. I mean, after all, everyone is afraid of the Babylonians, and they want allies against the Babylonians. And so Egypt is trying to bring about this alliance as much as they possibly can. They've conquered the Assyrians and many other peoples, and so they are trying to get a stronghold against the Babylonians. But Nebuchadnezzar gained control of the region following the Battle of Carchemish, and he permanently put down the Egyptians at that battle and established the Babylonians as the dominant force in the region. Now, during this time, Jehoiakim had changed sides and reluctantly became pro-Babylonian and willingly paid tribute to Babylon. But But the siege happened, and the fall of Jerusalem were a result of Egypt trying to rebel, and Jehoiakim switching sides again and rebelling with Egypt against Babylon. So you've got Jehoiakim who's going back and forth. And as a result, Nebuchadnezzar says, I've had enough. Let's do this. And he lays siege. And everything that we've talked about, all that historical stuff, is basically summed up in the first 2 verses of Daniel where we read, if you would. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. That sums up all that historical stuff that was going on. Now, what you don't see here is a godly king and a godly nation and a godless king and a godless nation that go to war to see who's the greater of the two. You don't see that. What we actually have here is a godless king who takes complete control of a region, and a king who was faithless to God happens to be on the throne when God judges his people. I mean, think about it. Too often we try to reduce the Bible to good guys and bad guys, don't we? Cain and Abel. Moses and Pharaoh. David and Goliath. And it can't be made that simplistic because they're all bad guys, just like us. Ooh, that's tough. But in the eyes of God, we're all bad guys. We've all fallen short of His glory. And none of us is perfect. Matter of fact, the Scriptures tell us in Romans, if you would, I'll get to the page here. As it is written, no one is righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. So in God's eyes, we're all bad guys. So there has to be more than just the clash of 2 kings and kingdoms. There is also, if you would, the clash of 2 gods. See, in ancient times, when you went into battle, you would call upon your God because the idea of secular nations at that time just didn't exist. Everybody had a God that they worshipped at that point in time. It wasn't like you could go to some nation and they were totally secular or anything like that. They all had their gods. And every nation, like I said, they called upon their gods when they prepared to go into battle because, you want to be on the right side of your God when you go into battle so that He'll fight for you. And so they believe that whoever has the strongest God won. Think about that. That's important to understand going into the book of Daniel. They believed whoever has the stronger God won. And whoever won brought back their gods as captives, just like the people are brought back as captives. Okay? Taking their gods or God captive, or articles of their God, is the same as saying that our God is stronger than your God. You are ours because your God bows down to our God. That's the perspective going into Daniel. The Jews even had that perspective. Remember way on back in the Old Testament when they went into battle without the Ark of the Covenant and lost? They thought, we forgot to bring God with us. Let's go back and get Him. So they had that perspective. So Nebuchadnezzar doesn't just take the people captive. If you would, he takes articles from the temple to place in the temple of his God to make the public statement that the God of Judah bowed down to the God of Babylon. And that is the perspective that the Jews have at this point in time. Our God bowed down to the God of Babylon. Hence, our first question, is our God really God? And so seeing these articles taken out of the temple would cause the people of Judah to feel even more dejected and demoralized. Not only had they lost the battle, their God lost too. And keep in mind, They don't have the luxury we've got to sit down and go back and just kind of read this as something in the past. If you would, they're living it. This is their life. This is what they are going through at that point in time. And so in their minds, to them, if you would, Nebuchadnezzar's God is stronger than their God. In their eyes, the Lord God Almighty has been defeated. Like I said, they don't have the luxury of reading what Daniel wrote at the beginning of his book in verse 2, where he said, if you would, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. Understand what Daniel said? This didn't happen because Nebuchadnezzar's God was more powerful. That's not why it happened. What Daniel is saying is, if you would, the Lord was still in absolute control of the situation, and he was using Nebuchadnezzar to judge his people. Contrary to what the Jews would have felt and believed going into that situation, God had not surrendered. Rather, God was in control, and he was running the show. The Lord raised up Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord gave the people into his hands, and at no time did the Lord God ever abdicate his sovereign authority over nations and peoples. The events that took place is because God is punishing his people by sending them away into exile. He's allowing them to fall. The Lord God is doing this, not Babylon's God. And that is the underlying message throughout Daniel. And that is, if you would, God is in control. Think about this. We're real comfortable about saying God is in control when everything is going well, aren't we? But when things seem to be falling apart, what do we start doing? If you would, where's God? Why is this happening? Where was God when that took place? How could this be? Where is God? I mean, if he's in control, why? And we've allowed ourselves to buy into the theology that when God is in control and paying attention, then everything will go well for his people the way we think it should. Like we have some kind of agreement going on with God. Hey, I do what you tell me, and nothing bad's going to happen. God says it don't work that way. I don't make deals. But as a result, when things don't go the way we think they should, then we begin to ask, where is he? You know, like, oh, God, are you asleep? Are you too busy? You know, did you get sidetracked? You know, I know you're busy, but can you take care of this? You know, hey, God, this isn't how things are supposed to go, according to my vision board or my goal list. You ever notice how God has a tendency to change our plans? I mean, we don't want to admit it, but that is really how we tend to approach things that happen in our lives. But let's take a closer look at what is happening throughout Daniel. Very quickly, just several scriptures, if you would. Daniel 1:9. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. And then later on down in verse 17, to these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And then in Daniel 2:11, what the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans. Daniel 2:19 through 20. During the night the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. And then on down at verse 27, first part of 28, Daniel replied, No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. And then down in verse 44, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another. Are you starting to see a pattern here? God's running the show all through Daniel. He's in charge. He is making things happen. So yes, the book of Daniel is about the clash of gods, but only one of them is the true God. And so if you would, the book of Daniel impresses upon us that there is only one true and living God, and He is in control no matter what the circumstances might be. Regardless of what you and I might be going on in our lives, regardless of what may be going on in our nation, regardless of what may be going on in the world, God is in control. He has not abdicated, and He never will. He raises up kingdoms, He brings kingdoms down. That will never change. So here's the question for them and for us. If God is in control, then if you would, why are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and the others taken away, castrated, and then made to serve a pagan king? Well, let's look outside of the book of Habakkuk for a little bit, the book of Daniel for a little bit more insight. Habakkuk has complained to God about the horrible spiritual condition of Judah, and then God replies in verse 5 of the first chapter, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty people whose own strength is their God." So what is He doing that you wouldn't believe? If you would, He is bringing a wicked king to judge His people. And the Jews are probably thinking to themselves, well, but God, I mean, we're your people. How are you going to use a godless nation to punish your people? I mean, we're your people. He's godless. To which God would probably reply, is there another godly nation I can use? I didn't think so. Find me one, and I'll use it. Oh, there isn't one. Then here come the Babylonians. Jeremiah writes in chapter 5, "People of Israel, declares the Lord, I am bringing a distant nation against you, an ancient and enduring nation, a people whose language you do not know, whose speech you do not understand." Over and over in the other prophets, God basically was warning them. And now the situation has happened. Because you see, if you would, God sent the Babylonians to conquer Judah because of Judah's wickedness and sin, because of kings like Jehoiakim, because of idolatry. I mean, do you see the irony in all of this? Because you see, if you would, they serve the one true and living God, but they keep chasing after other gods. They've got the one true God who's been there for them, who has brought them out of slavery, who's watched over them. They've got Him to serve, and yet they keep running after other gods. So God basically says, you want to serve other gods who are not gods at all? Okay, I can make that happen. Enter the Babylonians. God judged Judah because of their wickedness. You remember the questions we asked at the beginning? If you would, is our God really God? The answer is an emphatic, if you would, yes. And He proves that He is God even in the midst of the most horrendous of circumstances, as we watch the book of Daniel unfold. Have you ever found yourself asking that question? Is God really God? I'm sure many of you have asked that question in some way at some point in your life, maybe not realize that's what you were asking, as you face circumstances you just couldn't wrap your mind around. Maybe the question came in the form of, if you would, why is this happening if God is really God? But please, understand the theology behind that question that says, if you would, if God is really God, then bad stuff shouldn't happen to people that belong to Him. I mean, that's what we're actually saying when we ask that question. If God's really God, then bad stuff shouldn't happen to us. What did Jesus say? In this world you will have trouble. Interesting how sometimes our theology slips a little bit off center, away from what the Scriptures actually say. We don't realize it. I mean, think about it. The spotless, sinless Lamb of God was crushed and killed by the Father for the Father's glory, but we think we shouldn't experience bad stuff. Even the one individual who walked the face of the earth, the only individual to walk the face of the earth and was perfect, still faced bad stuff and was killed. And then we ask, why is this happening to me? I mean, when we begin to dissect the question, we begin to realize the arrogance behind the question. I mean, perhaps we've forgotten what we deserve. You know, what would happen to us if we were given what we do justly deserve? Just maybe for the things we said yesterday or did yesterday. We still live in a fallen world. And God owes us nothing. And He is sovereign over all things. Now, if I'm correct, I mean, the death rate in this world is still 1 per person. We're all going to die. Still 1 per person. At some point, every one of us is going to die unless Christ comes first. Not going to escape it. Which means any one of us or all of us could die today. It's coming. You see, the question isn't answered by our circumstances, is God really God? And the answer overwhelmingly jumps off the pages at us throughout the book of Daniel, that if you would, our God really is God. Regardless of the circumstances, He's still God. Even when we find ourselves wondering where He's at, even when we feel like maybe He's taken a vacation or something, when we feel like maybe He's turned His back on us, He's still God. He's still there. He's still in control. We're going to begin to answer that question more fully next week as we begin to dive into the meat of the book of Daniel and look at that question from the perspective of Daniel and the rest of the exiles. As we move through the book and try and gain the perspective that God would have us to have as we read through, and get away from the moralism and begin to look at it through the eyes of a redeemed people, a Christ-centered approach. But I think one of the things that the book of Daniel tells us right from the very beginning, God's going to have His way, even if He has to bring down a nation to do it. Even if He has to raise up an evil nation to punish those who are supposed to be following Him, He will do it. God's going to have His way. He's not going to sit back and say, oh, well, I wasn't really planning on that happening, so let's go to a plan B. No. God is going to have His way. Do you have any decisions on your heart today? Maybe some perspectives you need to change in the way you look at things. I would invite you to do that today.